and that's not exactly the challenges we've been grappling with. And so maybe, well, the last thing I would say is maybe learning enough of the lessons about the conflicts of the last and learning to avoid getting entrapped in blood, treasure, energy on failed, stupid conflict shouldn't have been in the first place. And then looking at that energy, that attention, those resources, in order to figure out how to revivify our domestic political economies so as to make them work better for all. That would be, I think, the greatest challenge.
Of our panelists, I realize that each has played a role in the history of global affairs. So I'm going to introduce them chronologically, not by age or alphabetical order, but by when they first to making CGA. Bill Keller, editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project. In 2003, then executive editor of the New York Times, before there was a Center for Global Affairs. And we were in a brownstone on 10th Street. He was in conversation with Michael Kaufman, a legend at the New York Times. The series was World Relations. We're delighted to have him back. Phil Alston, professor of law at NYU School of Law, coach at Center for Human Rights Justice Program, and currently Special UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He moderated one of our events, and before there was a Center for Affairs. It was in 2003. It was a conversation between Alex Borain, a good friend, former deputy chair of Africa Truth and Reconciliation Trials. Then, at that time, Justice Navi Pillay, who was most recently, until September, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, academic chair, leader of the Energy Environment Concentration, an extraordinary teacher, and I mean that, and mentor, and the second person to be hired full-time as faculty at our center. Alexis Gelber, award editor and journalist, and top editor at Me For Us, host of a popular CGA called Perspectives in Global Media. And finally, Gideon Rose, who I've already introduced, so I'm not going to go over that again. But finally, our evening editor, Miller, came down with a terrible virus and is not with us tonight. But we are very, very lucky to have Jim, who also was with us at CGA, actually, 2008, when he was a panelist on and the U.S., the relationship between nations and the United States, and more recently in 2000, that we did on the U.S. election context. He's currently at the Center on International Cooperation here at NYU, and he has kindly moderated. He's also all sorts of global issues from any country. His most recent book is The Freedom Agenda, Why American Democracy Just Not the Way George Bush Did. And he teaches a class on foreign policy in Abu Dhabi. We are thankful and delighted, and you're in for a treat to have him moderate this series.
Thanks so much. I think I have a microphone here, actually. I know what I have. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Yes? No? No? Use the mic. I know what I use the mic. I have a mic, but maybe I have to.
So, thank you very much. And first, I'd like to apologize for not being Arthur Miller. So, many come to see Arthur wag his marvelous eyes. I have those eyebrows. But I've watched Arthur my best. And I will function both as moderator, and to some extent, I'm going to give myself the right to be a participant as well. So I want to start with Gideon's rather, I think, hopeful take on the world. Refreshing, because we're just so accustomed to hearing that everything's going to hell. And what Gideon said, I think, is that the advice he would give is that American leaders should try to go with the clear positive trends in the world and not try to entangle themselves in things they can't do.
Yes.
And it immediately made me think of our poor president, in 2011, announced that he was going to make a pivot to Asia. And in effect, what he was saying, pivot to the place that embraces the things Gideon was talking about: globalization, information technology, all the things that will lead to prosperity and stability, as against the Middle East. And I think that fact reminds us that the world seems to be increasingly dividing between those peoples and regions that embrace those things and those that don't. And so I want to start by asking about the don't. And so obviously we've got this terrorist situation in Iraq and Syria, led by a group that violently rejects modernity. So what I'd like to first, let me ask you, Bill, first. Should we feel, as perhaps Gideon does, and I'll want to ask him as well, that this is a terrible thing, but we are maybe exaggerating how grave a risk it is to world order or to ourselves? Or should we see this as something which is a deep wishes to requires something like the kind of response President Obama has ordered?
I should probably preface my answer by saying that the last time I came down, it was to discuss the fact that I had become a reluctant of invading Iraq. So anybody in the audience who remembers that will probably want to take what I have to say with a grain of salt. I've spent a lot of time since then retracting bit by bit that reluctant point of view. I think that ISIS clearly requires some kind of a response. It does not require the kind of response that Bush or John McCain would probably advocate. I mean, clearly, seriously, I do think there's an element of hype. I think watching those videos has caused, what was a political concern, an academic turn into a very visceral concern, and that's one of the downsides, I guess, of information. I have, and his approach to the world, generally approve of his. I think he's erred on the side of caution a few times, but I think on ISIS he's got it about right.
So you would say the coalition he's put together, the bombing and so forth, is a...
Yes, I would. Actually, the last year I also had some fun at the expense of Tom Friedman, with whom I often disagree. So I brought something along that Tom Friedman wrote that I actually agree with. It proposes a sort of framework for how to think about this world. He's been writing these columns lately about how it's order versus the world of disorder. Bear with me. He says, and this is his prescription to approach the problem of the bifurcated world. He says, where Libya, Iraq, Syria, Mali, Chad, Somalia, with every source of local, regional, and international order to contain the virus, the barbarism burns itself out. These groups can't govern, so ultimately local representatives. Where there's a top-down order, think Egypt or Saudi Arabia, try to make it more decent. Less decency, or Kurdistan, try to make it more consensual and effective, to make it more. And where there's order plus democracy, think Tunisia, and to preserve and strengthen it with financial and security assistance so it can become a model for emulation by the states and peoples around it. And last but not least, be humble. We don't have the wisdom, resources, or staying power to do anything more than contain these organisms.
So that's an important space to occupy. The McCainite do everything, and isolationists do nothing. Carolyn, let me ask you a variant of this question, then I'm going to be happy to have any of you step into this. So, is it plausible to fear that this thing that we see with ISIS, which is this organization which is capitalizing on the sense of embitterment, outrage, alienation, isolation, a movement towards a more reactionary view of Islam, that this may not be a one-time only event, that maybe in fact what we're seeing in ISIS is the first of the would-be caliphates, that maybe in fact Nigeria is going to have something like this, and Somalia. In fact, the world may be confronted with these ungoverned spaces which turn into these terror states.
Well, yes. I mean, I think we're already seeing that. I mean, I think you see it in Nigeria. You see it. I see it in, for example, in Central Asia. So, when you look at, for example, a country like Uzbekistan, which is highly authoritarian, you have groups, you have radical groups, the Islamic movement, for example, of Uzbekistan, who has come out very forcefully in support of ISIS. So where you don't have those spaces for any kind of involvement in government, very much sort of isolated, that I think ISIS sort of speaks to the disenfranchised, to those that want to see a stronger Islamic movement within their states, where governments, for example, as I said, throughout Central Asia, where they really are trying to contain the Islamic movement. ISIS is sort of a movement that they feel that they can to, and that I find very frightening for a region that I know very well, that sort of right now it's relatively stable, but it's very vulnerable to successionist change. And I think in terms of Nigeria, as we were talking earlier, this is a country where the disparity of wealth is just so extreme. A country that's very, very rich in resources, and there's been absolute, abhorrent mismanagement. So I think the opportunities for these radical groups are great. I think it's very frightening.
So it also region to worry about. You weren't worried about the stands, okay? So everybody now, when they go home, should add that to their list of things that are going to keep them awake at night. That raises a question which I'd be eager to hear about from anybody. I mean, I think both Gideon in saying that it's not in the United States' interest to try to reverse trends over which it has very little control. The thing that Bill read from Tom Friedman, which said, when you have these either chaotic situations or thuggish states, maybe you can work with the neighbors, but there's not a whole lot you can do. What happens? See, we see this situation where things that are terrible and terrifying for the neighborhood, and possibly, we don't know, quite dangerous for ourselves, are brewing, and yet we have this hard-earned sense we can't do a whole lot. So what's the answer to that? Again, this is something for anybody. Look around, not just right now at ISIS, but these other places, Yemen, Somalia, whatever. Should the United States just accept the fact that it's bad, but probably the wisest policy is to let it burn itself out, to use Tom Friedman's words? Who wants to take that one on? Someone's got to. Philip?
Go ahead. Well, I guess on any panel you need someone, you need an extremist, so
Please
perhaps
do.
I should take that position. I think that the policy response to ISIS is sadly mistaken. I don't think there's any such thing as a limited military engagement, particularly one which involves bombing. I think we are going to inexorably drawn into a larger and conflict. I don't think any American president will have the courage to say, this exercise failed, unfortunately. Those bastards have won, so I'm withdrawing. It's not on. So what we are on now slope. I think the problem is that for a whole range of reasons we have demonized Islam. Again, since Bill only reads the news, I can refer to a column ago about the different faces of Islam and how we need desperately to start distinguishing those extremists who are not perhaps so different from deeply fundamentalist extremist Christians or other religious groups, and not to think, my God, ISIS is going to suddenly take over, it's going to be an Islamic State, we have to stop that. We actually can't stop that if it's going to happen, and our bombing won't prevent it. So I think what we need precisely is the 10-year strategy. If you, how do we deal with it? And I think it's quite plausible that the ISIS people, a bit like Boko Haram, may well have sat down and said, how do we provoke the silly old United States and Australia, where I come from, which follows the US in absolutely everything? How do we best provoke them and draw them into all of this so that we have an enemy, which we really need, and that's going to be the best recruiting tool? And I think we're going right down that road.
I want to ask you something. Let's say you're wrong. Okay?
I don't accept that premise.
Okay, it's a hypothetical. Let's say you're wrong. And in fact, the United States takes your advice, chooses not to act, essentially allows ISIS to consolidate its control over this vast area of Iraq and Syria. Now, let's say we don't know, obviously, what their goal is. They probably don't know beyond this caliphate. But let's say their next goal is to attack the near abroad and then the not so near abroad. It becomes a great place to incubate terrorist acts against Europe and the United States. Would you then say, that was a mistake on my part? We have to accept that's one of the prices we're going to be paying in the world going forward.
I would say that I grew up in Australia during the era in Southeast Asia when we talked about the domino theory. And the domino theory, my friends, was that if we let Vietnam fall, the rest of us for it. And I think we're tending to do the same thing here. I think, as Friedman said, maybe you've got to let these outfits burn themselves out. I think if ISIS comes to power, it's going to be a tragedy for the people who suffer under it, but at the same time they will show themselves very clearly to be utterly incompetent and not able to be tolerated, and there'll be a pushback.
So, Alexis,
but I think domino theories are really bad for policy.
Alexis, I'm curious, do you Pope's analogy that this is like the idea of international communism in the 1960s, and it is just as mistaken to have an aggressive response to it as it was, let's say, to do so in Southeast Asia, thinking, if not here, then every place else?
Well, there's a certain way in which the presentation of the news, because of technology, is creating a sense where we're a little bit confused about what's the smoke and what's the fire. Obviously, these videos shocked the world. They were savage and they were terrifying. But we're living in this kind of world where we're experiencing events in real time. We are, maybe there was a delay of 2 weeks between one beheading and the time in which the video was released. But I think there is a sense of this kind of 24/7 kind of news where we are we are getting a sense of immediacy and urgency and a sense that we need to act.
And would you say that Obama wound up getting, in effect, railroaded to excessive action by virtue of this public outrage over the beheading?
It was terrifying and it was shocking, and the repetition of this was part of what made it seem like it wasn't going to stop. So perhaps, if you want to call it railroading, maybe.
But do you think it was a mistake on his part? I mean, Bill said his strategy on balance correct. What's your feeling?
I'm not sure that it was a mistake, but I am concerned about the pace of the reaction.
So Gideon, what's your thought about this?
A decade and more ago, Bill famously wrote a piece in which he a member of the I Can't Believe I'm a Hawk Club. I kind of feel the opposite now, like I'm a member of I Can't Believe I'm a Dove club, because I've been on the opposite side of many of these, but, you know, like the character in the music, Robert Weiser now. And I think that, yeah, I think he was railroaded, and I think that the president all too often starts out with a sensible policy and seems to get stick with it for a long time and then get sick of taking a lot of heat for it and tries to give a speech to make the heat go away, but does so in a way that simply exaggerates the heat because he commits himself to a larger goal and then does something and keeps going forward. I actually am not that worried about mission creep here because I think he ultimately is not going to get dragged back in too much. But there's a danger of that, and I think we didn't have to have that quite that danger. I mean, I guess what I would say here is I think the broader picture of what's happening in the Obama foreign policy is the reestablishment or readjustment of the notion of a core. Before 9/11, we had a sense of core and periphery in the world, and there were areas that we had expanded into after the Cold War ended. With 9/11, the entire world core, or rather there was no such thing as a periphery. You had to pay attention to everything that happened everywhere. Micromanaging the political development in Fallujah and Helmand, whatever, was crucial. The Obama administration clearly wanted to get away from that and has been trying to restrict the notion of core, pull back a little bit. But the question of they're getting pushback because we no longer like to think of that. The people who say, oh, what Putin did in Ukraine is a first step and he's going to keep going forward, and next, I don't think there's a chance in hell that Putin is going to attack Estonia. I mean, there's an all world between NATO and not NATO. And the fact is he can attack Ukraine because Ukraine isn't in NATO. And we provoked him by saying we might want to take Ukraine in NATO. Ukraine was not part of the American defense perimeter. There are other things that are, and we have a commitment. However much we might have been a little slow or hesitant in the reaction to the Ukraine crisis, I don't think anybody in the world has any doubt that if you actually did something against a NATO country, the Article 5 security guarantee would come into play. And in the same kind of way, so if, you know, you had several steps in your hypothetical, you would start to worry about ISIS after they did this and then did that. Well, before that happened, or at some point along, other people would start to worry too. My father used to have a rule that I liked, which was, if 3 people tell you you're drunk, go and lie down. And I think that's actually not a bad rule for international relations as well, in the sense that I'm not a big multilateralist in principle. I don't actually necessarily believe that there's a huge amount of principled reason for doing things multilaterally instead of unilaterally. But if you get a whole bunch of people who are supposedly at risk to worry as much as you do, then that's a kind of sign that things aren't yet ripe for action. And it's also going to be a sign that it's going to be difficult to act. If the things you talked about started to happen, Jim, then suddenly you wouldn't have quite as much difficulty pulling together an anti-ISIS coalition. A little tougher down the road. But the fact is, we used to say in the Middle East process, you can't want this more than the locals. Right now, we want to be anti-ISIS more than everybody else around. And that's not a wise move or a practical recipe for success.
Bill, I'm curious if you've changed your views on Syria. My recollection is that you felt strongly that Obama, and I think you repeated it just now, that Obama was too unwilling to act in Syria in the face of an unspeakable atrocity. Do you feel now that that moment has passed? It's become
I do. I mean, a year and a half ago, I thought there was still, and longer ago than that, I thought there was a real chance that he could actually influence for the better. I'm much more dubious about that now just because of the way things have evolved. But I'd really like to hear from both Phil and Gideon, I guess, who now belong to the, well, let's just wait and see camp regarding ISIS. What do you actually think is, if we back off, withdraw our support from the Peshmerga, say screw it to the Iraqis and stop bombing, that they will get Syria and Iraq with the largesse they've stolen from every bank and all the oil revenues they've countered, that they'll settle for colonizing Syria and Iraq and turn into Luxembourg, or What exactly do you, at what point do you begin to get a little bit alarmed about these barbarians?
I'll get my answer, but it's going to piss a lot of people off, so.
If it's too difficult for Gideon to answer, what fool am I to step in? My principle, first of all, I don't like what's happening there, believe it or not. So I think the United States, I think other Western countries ought to be as supportive as they possibly can. I think what we need to get beyond is the sort of knee-jerk reaction that the United States has long been very fond of, which is that we have to use military action to demonstrate the seriousness of our concern. Military action has generally not been very effective in recent years. It hasn't been effective it wasn't effective in Iraq, and I don't think it's going to work in this context.
By the way, do you think Libya was a mistake? The Libya intervention?
Give me time. I'll need to think about that. I think it's a very mixed bag. I didn't actually support it at the time. Now I think the Libyan situation is pretty tragic. How else would we have brought about change? I don't know. But that's a bigger topic.
But so let me different question then. If would you say that Obama should have permitted ISIS to take Baghdad, or really to move on Baghdad, if that's what would have happened absent any kind of strikes?
Well, first of all, that premise is very much open to question. But I think if you've got a movement that is that powerful, that is able to mobilize that many people, that it can take Baghdad, how's the United States going to stop that? Are we going to just continue to up our military involvement? We're going to put all the boots back on the ground, and we're going to be fighting what would, by definition, be a pretty huge popular movement? I don't think that's a good move.
Well, I have to say, when Harry Truman gave a speech in 1947 saying that the United States has to step into the vacuum in Greece and Turkey because the British can no longer do so, and we fear that this will be the soft flank for us, it may have been a mistake. I don't think it was, but it certainly sent a message to the world that the United States feels that no one is able to be a kind of guarantor of world order. It created a precedent, which I think we're seeing now, that nobody wants to fill that vacuum. The United States winds up filling that vacuum. It's a disaster to fill that vacuum, and yet if you don't fill that vacuum, the disaster may be worse.
But Jim, he said Greece and Turkey. He didn't say absolutely everywhere.
That's not true. Actually, the Truman Doctrine said absolutely everywhere. We're going to start in Greece and Turkey.
The globalization of containment and the Truman Doctrine into this broad ideological commitment arguably was one of the mistakes of the early Cold War that helped some other problems such as Vietnam. What I would say is, Bill asked what I would do about ISIS and stuff. Someone asked me the other day what I would do. Did I agree with Obama? Not what I would do. I said I would do the same policy, but 50% of it and talk about it 80% less. Do 50% less and talk about it 80% less. I think you made a straw man in the sense that not going into bombing in Syria doesn't mean that you have to walk away or abandon all of Iraq or the Kurds. I think you can give a little bit of help. I think containing it, I agree with exactly what Tom said in that column. The fact is ISIS has expanded to its natural limits, right? This is a place, this is a group that has preyed in the Petri dish of the chaos in Syria and Iraq, and played on the sectarian divisions in Iraq because the Sunnis were alienated by the Shia government that was incompetent and vicious and excluded a large swath of the country. So that's why they could expand into Iraq. They've reached the limits of that. The Kurds are pushing back. The Shia are pushing back. There's no place for them to go. They're not because they don't want to draw the Kurds in. They can't really go too far in Syria. So what's going to happen? If we can contain them in the areas where they are now, they'll do a lot of damage in the Badlands of Syria and Iraq and the Sunni areas of Iraq. This is not good. It is possible that over time that might lead to some problems elsewhere. It's going to be certainly crappy for any of the populations living in that area. But at the end of the day, that strikes me as a lesser evil. In the long run, they have no answers to modernity. They have no answers to governance. They have no answers to a broader geopolitical picture. And they ultimately will fall afoul of things. And letting them fall by the wayside while keeping the problem contained and you asked when I would go in? If they went after the oil fields in terms of significant and dramatic ways. Oh my God, that's such a horrible realist answer. Why do we only care about the Middle East because of oil? Well, the answer is yes. If they actually were to go after the oil,
But they are
and
going,
be
they're
able to
already
do so.
going after the oil. I mean, that's partially what's funding ISIS, is the fact that they, they're bringing in millions of dollars a day. They're
I
selling
meant going
oil
after
to
it by
Turkey.
destroying it or not selling it. If they sell it, and that's actually in some ways ironically less bad.
But I would just, I just want to throw one thing is, it really disturbs me. I mean, in terms of going back to Syria, is that, horrific crimes against humanity, and the fact that, the United States and the international community, 2 people were killed in Syria. And I think to say that, I think we should have done something. We should have done a lot more earlier. I think.
Let me ask a different question, though, which one of the things Obama has tried to do and clearly not succeeded in is finding a language to speak to the American people that will make them feel like foreign engagements are worth doing. And as a question going forward, how is it you're going to be able to shake the American people out of what now seems an apathy and almost a surly hostility about foreign engagements? So I think Gideon's idea is, let's focus on the things that are positive and successful. And again, Obama tried to do that and hasn't been able to, because he's gotten sucked back into the Middle East. And so I wonder, what's the language way that you can actually persuade Americans that deep engagement with the world is in not just the world's interest, but Americans' interest? And I wonder if Gideon's his pragmatic realism is the kind of language that the American people will respond to. I'm skeptical of that.
I certainly don't necessarily think people will respond. I have no idea how to sell the policies. I just come up with them.
Anybody
If I knew how to do what you're saying, I'd run for office, but I don't think I ever would. So
Okay.
because I wouldn't,
Anybody
no one would
else?
vote for me.
Just, quickly, we're all language people, talk or write for a living, and I think value effectiveness of words, and I think the effectiveness of words has actually been diminished as everybody's access to every pair of ears on the planet has grown. So I think the idea that if Obama just pitched the case differently, Americans would rise up in support of him. They rose up in response to a video of beheading, but they have not responded to a fireside chat, nor do I think
But so
they would likely to.
is the underlying fact that that the default condition of the American public is not isolationist necessarily, but certainly a sense of a kind of ill-tempered self-sufficiency, sense of threat. Therefore, we just shouldn't expect that when the sense of threat subsides, they're going to be that interested in being engaged with the world. Is that just the reality, Alexis?
I think that what is just war weary. And I think that, the engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan with repeated deployments and the sort of images of these sort of wounded warriors and, have left these kinds of scars in terms of the public sentiment. And I don't know a president who thinks of it, who is a writer too, and has somehow been frustrated in his ability to give the great speeches anymore. It's not going, the words are not going to lift people out of their skepticism and cynicism.
Is there something that will?
I think the videos were very scary, and they shocked people into maybe wanting to do the right thing or wanting to. But I think that there is a kind of a sense of uncertainty and a fear of getting sucked back into a kind of endless engagement militarily.
Well, so Philip, your field is human rights, and you'd like to see a foreign policy that was more deeply infused with those moral obligations. I assume that's a fair assumption. Do you feel that that's something that people will respond to if this president or some other president was more explicit about America's nations. This, in effect, is almost the opposite of Gideon's point, that would actually be the kind of rallying cry that people would respond to?
Let me just say, first of all, in response to your earlier comment about the American people's wariness or weariness of international engagement, that so much of that conversation is about military engagement. And my point is that America shouldn't be thinking of its engagement in those terms. So I'm happy for wariness and weariness. But where it has to engage is in a much broader range of issues. Ebola, the various economic crises and so on. There is no choice, and I think the American people realize that globalization is a reality and they've got to engage.
Okay, how, for example, do you, I mean, I think you're being too generous to this problem. I mean, Americans believe that development assistance is 10% or 25% of the budget or something crazy. Know that it's bad. It is a certainty that helping other countries is a waste of our money. This has become a kind of shibboleth. How do you solve the problem?
A lot of international assistance is a waste of money, it has to be said. I'm not in the camp with Jeffrey Sachs and others who think that the more truckloads of money we can ship out, the happier things will be out there. I think the real challenge, since you put it in the development area, is not development assistance, but is getting things like taxation and fiscal policy under control. The biggest problem in Africa, I was in the Central African Republic last month, I'll be back there again this month in a different context, but I've got a reasonably good feel, are things like money. Mention was made of Nigeria a moment ago, an extremely rich country, money leaking out in all directions because we in the West don't really want to try to staunch the flow. We don't insist on the transparency initiatives that are out there so that oil companies have to declare their money and so on.
Philip, what's the leverage we would have to do the right thing in these cases?
We are currently, in the context of the OECD, the Rich Countries Economic Club, discussing all sorts of measures relating to transparency, relating to tightening up tax regimes and so on. Both the United States and the European Union are very reluctant to go all the way. We're much more interested in protecting our multinational corporations and others than we are in enforcing the sort of transparency that would stop the corruption, that would stop the failure of so many countries to collect any of the taxes that would enable them to do much more than any of our development assistance could do.
Is any kind of assistance to badly governed countries, to corrupt countries, is that a waste of money, no matter what the form is? Because unless it's a decently governed country, it's just going to be pissed away? This is a question anybody would like to address, because I think we really, we have to figure out what good can the United States do in the world and where.
Well, I would say yes. I think one of the great innovations in international social policy has been the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which are now being replaced or going to be followed on with the Sustainable Development Goals, and the conditionality of aid in return for aid in return for changes and certain kind of policy things was something that revolutionary back 15 years ago. It was seen as a cold-blooded and hard-hearted approach, and it's worked very well. And I think we have learned that sort of unrestricted aid is usually not, to governments that don't do good things with it, is not a helpful thing for anybody and breeds a kind of reaction. I think in terms of the answers for the public or what they will support, I think they tend to be very pragmatic. The American public is not stupid. They don't like being they're not manipulated easily with emotional appeals. They want competence. And they want competence and sort of practical idealism. And we could use, I was reading a piece, there's an interview in the Atlantic, this current issue. I shouldn't talk about another publication, but it's true, with Bill Clinton. Jim Bennett did an interview with Bill Clinton in the Atlantic, and he was talking about the CGI, the Clinton Global Initiative. And I actually am not a huge fan of it, because I think some of it's kind of silly stuff and that doesn't actually work. But the way he was talking about it was so good. I could see it was that typical Clinton reaction. You listen to him and you get carried along, even if you think the guy is sleazy, even if you think he's a political hack. I was like, by the end, I was willing to take out my give to the Clinton Global Initiative, because he was making this case for competent action that would actually produce results in a positive way with people who were doing effective change. Like, yes, yes. That's the kind of thing people need. They want competence. They're cynical, they're upset, they think their politicians lie to them, and they have very good reason to, because the last 15 years of public policy have been a giant screw-up across the board. And I think if we had better, more honest salesmanship about them, people would go
Well,
along.
so Carolyn, I'll come back to you in a second, Alexis. So take these countries that you know well, that none of us know anything about, these countries that end in Stan. So it's obviously in the United States to make those guys feel like we care about their fate. As you say, they may be on more of a precipice than we realize. Is there any, I mean, does the United States have levers to actually goodwill or make a difference in places like that? Or is that mostly going to be beyond American control?
I mean, I think if we look at sort of Central Asia, I think the United States sort of had more interest maybe in the 90s, but if we, for example, just look at the last decade, I think it's, China's footprint is all over Central Asia. I mean, they are, they're funding pipelines, they're all over across the 5 Central Asian countries. They have given tremendous, some of them loans for oil, loans for natural gas. So it very much looks like China's neighborhood, very much so, much more so than it did, for example, in the 1990s.
But that's true of Africa, right? In other words, Chinese investment in Africa was tiny in the 1990s. Now it's 100 times the size. I mean, is that a soluble problem? China is untrammeled. It has an enormous amount of capital at its disposal. It loves to build big things, dams, railroads, stuff like that. The Chinese like that. Dictators like that. How does the West compete with that?
Well, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to your other question. I mean, do we need to compete with that? I mean, this is China's sort of neighborhood. It makes sense that China would invest in Central Asia. I mean, the region is very rich in natural resources. China needs those resources. It's in terms of for energy security, it's easier for China to get oil from Kazakhstan than it is to get it from Nigeria. They don't have the same sort of in terms of maritime issues to deal with. But I don't think that the United States should completely disengage, but I think our soft power in the region has very much diminished. And it's very much Russia and China's
Which would be
neighborhood.
what? I mean, that means more diplomatic outposts, or what power that we used to have that we don't have and that we should have?
We used to do much more in terms of funding non-governmental organizations. We used to have, I think, just a better reach and sort of, we did more in terms of diplomatically. And I think, over the last 10 years, we have sort of, our sort of space in the region has changed. And partially it is a result of Afghanistan, and the United States has, had the region in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and some of the, I guess, part of the United States that we no longer have those bases, and so China has very much, sort of, in terms of looking at that region, China's sort of in terms of, and I think it's also important to note, and this goes back to also countries in Africa, is that they're not asking a lot of questions. So the idea is that most of this region is right. In terms of rule of law, does not really count for very much. Freedom of the press is kind of non-existent, and China doesn't ask any questions, and we do. And so it's easier for the region to work with.
Have a comfy
China
dictator-to-dictator relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Alexis, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to make another point about public opinion, and I think that we're looking ahead 10 years. One thing that we can't underestimate is generational change. A number of students in this room, and the generation, my kids' generation, kids who are in their 20s now, I see much more engaged with the world than their predecessors of the last decade, perhaps. They are themselves much more ethnically diverse. They have families that come from a wider range of countries who have immigrated here. And they themselves have of engagement with the world. My own feeling is that this is the 9/11 generation. They were deeply affected in ways they didn't even really understand by that event. They don't necessarily want to see military engagement, but about engagement with the world. And they are volunteering for things. They want to they want to do good in the world. And I think that that is something that may affect the ways in which we talk about these issues going forward, ways in which we talk about these issues that don't necessarily involve military solutions to go to.
I ask Alexis one more thing about that very question. So there's now all sorts of forms of social media intermediated engagement. There are these organizations like Avaaz, where what you do is you basically check a box and say, yes, I think we should ban whaling or something like that. And I can't tell if a genuine form of engagement that we should really be encouraging or a lazy shortcut that doesn't lead to much.
Well, I'm not really familiar with that, but I do see a lot of, I've spent time, at the Kennedy School. I've seen students going to, interested in going into public service, want to work for the State Department. They want to work for NGOs in different world. This is something that's going on. I do think the interconnectedness of digital life makes it possible for people to in different ways. I would also say that I just impressionistically have the sense that this generation also is much more familiar with global travel than their predecessors. So they've had an experience of engaging with the world in a practical, personal way.
So, Gideon.
Actually, I'm going to go with that and take that same point, but take it in a slightly different direction. You're talking about what are our soft power resources. When Joe and I first coined that phrase, he meant it as an alternative to hard power in the sense of hard power being the resources that allow you to get somebody to do what you want them to do, and soft power being the things that allow you to have them want what you want. And the idea was if they wanted what you want, you wouldn't need to coerce them because they'd already be there. It's not so much a manipulable act like diplomacy as opposed to that. It's almost your institutions, your values, your ideals that allow people to want to be on your side. It's the kind of things that make the Ukrainians, or a lot of them, want to be part of Europe rather than Russia, so that Russia has to clamp down. And on that regard, I'm talking about the next generation. We have a kinder, gentler, more cosmopolitan, more diverse next generation. They may be historically illiterate, and they may be spoiled, and they may be soft, and maybe I'm just looking at my kids. There's a warmth and an openness and a liveliness and a dynamism and a liberality to American society now that is still this extraordinarily attractive thing to the world at large. And however badly our society has problems, however crappily we treat our minorities, other people treat them more so. However much there is still repression or problems in different sectors and groups, it's even worse everywhere else. And so if you ask about what we can do for Central Asia, I'm not sure that much, but if we can have Central Asians, at least the ordinary citizens, saying, gee, I want more like that. I want to be a society. I want to have an open society in which I can be who I am. I think things like the movement and decision is a vast and incredible source of soft power term in a way that has never been discussed and isn't really relevant to these kind of discussions, but is huge because it represents a society in which you can hell you want to be, and that's what we're about, and you want to live your life uncontested. Other people around the world, especially as they develop economically, especially as they have order, will want that, and they'll look to us as a model if we can get our own public institutional act in order and live up to our own ideals.
Do any of you have the guts to take on Gideon's praise of young people? Who's going to diss young people here? So Philip.
Just to come back on on Gideon's opening theme and pick up on a couple of the other comments on information technology and this being the future. You mentioned Avaaz. It's a classic example of something that I find quite worrying. Avaaz doesn't stand for anything. There's no underlying values that they support per se. They support popular movements. They try to amplify popular movements. So I participated in the climate change march, which of us was pretty key in. What did they demand? Nothing. Action about climate change. They take all of the, and so one of the things that I worry about is that a lot of the social media and so on that we put a lot of faith in and we think this is really going to transform the future is not necessarily transformative in fact, even though it might be in process. And then to go back to the traditional mainstream, I don't know why Bill is still writing. It's beyond me, because his comment a moment ago was, oh, media, everyone can write now. There's no point in us really thinking we're going to have a big impact. I disagree with that, because I think my dearly beloved compatriot, Rupert Murdoch, has made an enormous difference in the world through what he has done with the media and is still doing. And I think it links back to where Gideon finished, but in a not away line, but he didn't really develop it big time, and that's the whole inequality thing that we're not doing anything about. And the inequality that we're sitting and watching grow and grow and grow in this country, but also in other countries, is very much linked to the power of the media and the distortion of the news that's getting across and the opinions that are being promoted. And I think they remain incredibly influential.
Well, so let me ask a question about kind of media, good or bad, because on the one hand, I think Philip is making the point that we live in such a powerful media environment. To despair of the capacity, your capacity as an individual to make a difference seems unnecessary, except that what you might say is no individual voice matters very much anymore. Now, I've just been hearing from White House officials who I've been talking to for an article that I'm writing, identical whine, which is the reason why Obama encounters such heavy weather, the reason why he can't get people to buy into his, we were talking about foreign policy initiatives, is we now live in a media environment that is so intrinsically toxic that it's not even about Obama and not even about his policies, but any president henceforward, they would have said probably the last couple years of Clinton, George W. Bush, and now Obama increasingly, such figure will no longer be able to enjoy anything like the authority, the sense of authority and legitimacy that his predecessors have, because every word he utters is immediately dismantled, scrutinized, exposed, ridiculed, and so forth. Is that a travesty of the world we live in, or is there some truth to that?
I find it really ironic that the man who was basically thought of as the first social media president is now whining about this.
I didn't talk to him. He was his people.
Yeah. No, but I mean, social media giveth and social media taketh away. It may not just be the media, it may be his authority as president.
Oh, there may actually be substance involved here, you're saying.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, okay. But let's talk for a second, since we're on this subject, about the revelations of surveillance and so forth that have become so much a part of our world. So, Bill, you were the editor of the Times when the WikiLeaks thing happened. WikiLeaks now seems like some remote event that we can't quite remember what it was about. At the time, it seemed like the end of the world. Has that actually turned out to be a less consequential event than it was?
Well, it only seemed like the end of the world within a certain media bubble, like in the newsroom of the New York Times and in the State Department in particular. No, I think that was one step in a series of steps that has led to where we are today. Before that, the Times published sort of 7 years before Snowden, the revelation that the NSA was tapping our phones without a warrant. WikiLeaks came along and laid bare how we conducted our foreign policy and our military policy. Snowden came along and opened the door even wider. And so there's this kind of ongoing tension between the people who want to keep the secrets and the people who want to expose the secrets. And it's not clear to me that either side is absolutely winning, because we haven't seen any particularly dire consequences of the exposures that you refer to. But it's a war.
But so it's also interesting that after the Snowden revelations about the NSA surveillance, there was a strong sense that now that the American people have discovered these dire secrets, things will change. And there were the things that usually happen. There was a high-level panel, which made a report to the president. The president accepted some things and then didn't accept others. And now the effort seems to have, the leading members of Congress have said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I wonder what this tells us, whether this does tell us anything about the national attitude towards these kinds of revelations, towards the fact that we live in a world where we can no longer assume that other communications are secure. Maybe it's something that, in fact, people accept because they've already accepted the private sphere, and though it was a big news event, it's actually not as big a social event as we.
I would disagree with that. I think there are tremendous concerns about privacy. And just yesterday, 2 days ago, we saw Twitter threatening to sue the government to release information to its users about government requests for user data. The social media companies aren't actually that social themselves, so they're clearly doing this in response to concern among their own users. I think there's a tremendous
But so Alexis, how do you think this is going to work out? That is, do you see the line for what is acceptable for either the state or private companies to know about us being pushed back? Because now that people understand that they've surrendered this stuff, they're not going to accept it?
I don't see how that's really going to change, but I think that people are going to be much more careful about their own practices. And then this, of course, raises, issues in terms of our dealing in a globalized world. Let's say in Europe, where there is a huge transatlantic tussle about privacy issues, and countries like France and Germany, much different view than our government does, and Germany in particular because of their own historical records of over record keeping in the Nazi era and in East Germany. So to take on a sort of policy concerns.
Gideon, you talked about this a little bit in your talk, and in terms of the balance between these new media being liberatory technologies and these new media being instruments of authoritarian control, is it clear to you which one has the upper hand or will have the upper hand?
Oh, I think in the long run, on balance, the liberation will be more than the control aspect, just because it disaggregates power.
Speak into the microphone. I think you're not.
I think in the long run, on balance, the liberating aspects will be greater than the controlling aspects, just because it'll ultimately be many-to-many communication in many different ways and many different things. And I'm more with the Shirkis than the Morozovs on this, if people follow that kind of debate. I think that this ties actually into the debate about the next generation, because I don't think. One of the striking things about the next generation is that they are growing up with a degree of public self-exposure that most of us 30, let alone over 40 or 50, find absolutely and yet they take it in stride. And what that will mean, they may be, the concept of privacy doesn't seem to exist for those kids as much. So whether the government violates it, since they're violating it themselves so often, it may not be as big a deal. I don't know. I don't think we're anywhere near the end of the story. We're just in the early stages, as you say, not just a cat and mouse game about who's doing what and will get what, but about social attitudes towards this. The idea, I can't even frankly imagine what it would be like to date. I've been married for 20 years, right? The idea of if, when we're on the dating scene now and you could literally Google you dated and have their entire life pretty much revealed for you, how would that affect? It's like, I can't even imagine that because it's so different from what was true back in the day when I was doing it. The idea of growing up where you could literally have your entire life revealed on social networks and somebody else wanted to know about you, that's a new world that our kids are growing up in, and what that implications are for their attitudes on a whole range of things, I think I have no clue about. But I know it's different from the old geezers.
Okay, let's just go ahead, and then
I'm just saying, I just want to add one thing, which is that there are new technologies that are being created to avoid detection. So the protests that we saw in Hong Kong, the messaging system that they used was something called Fire Chat, which is something that is off the grid and can't be detected or tapped into. And so, in the Cold War era, we used to talk about the nuclear arms race. Now I think there's a kind of digital tech arms race going on between the creators of new technologies, which are ever more elusive from prying eyes, governments and corporations who are trying to sort of find ways to tap into that information.
Bill, what about in terms of the press? That is, here we've elected as a constitutional law professor, and everybody assumed that he would be a tremendous change in terms of press freedom issues from George W. Bush, and yet nobody has prosecuted reporters more than this guy by an order of magnitude. Is that because it's this guy, or because something has changed in a way that has altered the relationship between the press and their sources?
I think there are a number of factors at work. One of them is that Democrats have to be more Catholic than the Pope on these issues, or feel that they do. And so, whereas you might have expected them to be a little more easygoing about the leaking of secrets, on the contrary, they're proving their manhood by indicting whistleblowers. Another factor is...
So we should elect a Republican next, because they won't have to prove their manhood on this one.
Personally, I had a much better relationship with the Obama administration than with the Bush administration, but that's just me.
Yeah.
But one other factor is, the technology that has contributed so much good to the world has also made it much easier to track down whistleblowers and leakers. Birds got to sing and prosecutors got to prosecute, and if prosecutors can do it without having to subpoena reporters anymore, or as much as they used to, because now they've got an electronic track of where every potential leaker has been and who he's been in touch with, it's easier to prosecute.
And sort of this goes to the other side of Gideon's hopeful view. That is, you're also saying in this case the technology has the effect of actually restricting the sphere of freedom.
Yeah. I agree with Gideon that in the kind of contest between control and liberation probably triumphs. I have some doubts that that's an unalloyed good thing, or that it doesn't come with some potentially unsavory consequences. I think the digital age has contributed to a polarization of our society. I think it's probably shortened our attention spans to some detrimental effect. It's also inevitable, so those downsides are the price we pay.
I want to ask about something else Gideon raised. So in kind of a catalog of things that we have trouble admitting to ourselves are actually really positive, but one he mentioned was fracking, and the whole idea that energy, which appeared to have been a scarce resource in a way that would really redound America's detriment, is turning out to be a more abundant resource in a way that redounds to America's benefit. So, Carolyn, since that's, again, it's a world energy-producing world of Russia, should we regard this as a tremendous opportunity for the United States to be able to escape a lot of the things that have restrained it, whether it's relations with the Saudis, whether it's even possibly Europe's dependence, parts of Europe's dependence on Russia, that this world of greater energy abundance is actually going to change in a positive way?
Well, Gideon already said it. It already has. So, and I think I think people sometimes don't realize what has happened in the United States since 2006. I mean, we 70% more oil than we did. We are close to producing 9 million barrels a day. We are already starting to export crude oil, and we're only going to export more in the future. We are, producing a tremendous amount of natural gas. We are seeing, we're seeing tremendous like tectonic shifts in terms of our energy landscape. And if you think back even in terms of sanctions against Iran, sanctions against Russia, I think that the United States, having this tremendous energy abundance has given it much more teeth to be able to implement these sanctions in a way that the United States has added 4 million barrels a day. So if you, for example, just last year, in 2007, you would have that what we're seeing today was then. Oil would be at $200 a barrel. The price of oil is going down. And that's like extraordinary. So in terms of what's been lost in Syria, what's been lost in Iraq, what's been in Libya, the United States has made up for all of the global output. And, Gideon had mentioned something that, trust experts. They're not always right, but when we go back to 2004, where the forecast was for the United States was running out of oil, that the world was running out of oil, that we were seeing peak oil, and that the United States we were preparing to import liquid, frantically trying to get it out to export.
So, but let me ask
Can I
Andy,
just-
I want to ask the opposite question, which is, isn't all this abundance a disaster for the climate? Because the only
Exactly.
way we're going to succeed climatically
Yeah.
is by leaving most of that carbon in the ground.
Well, yes and no. I mean, also, again, something that a lot of people is that we have actually reduced our carbon emissions by 20% since 2006. So we are currently at 1994 levels. And I'm not saying that there's not a lot of work to do, but I do think it's important that, the natural gas is displacing coal, and that's a positive. So in terms of the emissions from gas are less than from coal. There's still a lot of work to do, and we're doing tremendous advancements happening in terms of efficiencies. So, as I said, I think there's a lot to be concerned about regards to the climate. But at the same time, I mean, we have an economy, and we have a global economy that requires a huge amount of energy. And as much as I support renewable energy technologies, we're still not there yet.
You must get stoned by your students.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of short-term necessity crowding out what supreme long-term need.
Yeah,
so
but I also think it's really important to, like, if you look at wind, I mean, there are tremendous advancements. It's become much cheaper. So when you look at electricity generation, and I'm looking at John, we've radically changing what's going into our grid, and there's much more renewable going into the grid. So again, less coal, more natural gas. It's long term, I think it's ultimately better.
Well,
for
so,
our
but let me-
environment. In the short term, of course.
yes.
Well, it's still true that if we continue on the trend that we're on now, when CGA has its 20th anniversary, if we have it in this auditorium, we're all going to be wearing scuba suits.
Or at least bathing suits, just because it's going to be.
If not just fracking, I think as amazing as the shale revolution has been and will continue to be, you ain't seen nothing yet, frankly. Amazing as that is, what's even more significant is just how unexpected it was. Donald Rumsfeld used to talk about the unknown unknowns. The fact that our entire energy picture, in such a huge industry, in such an incredibly important area with so much expertise, could be revolutionized by technological developments in combination with a sort of capitalist financial system and distributed rights that allowed a kind of entrepreneurial set of independent companies to experiment and go forward. The most significant thing isn't just the energy, as amazing as that is. It's what the hell is the next fracking thing going to be? They're going to technologically, whether it's 3D printing, whether it's 4D printing, whether it's synthetic biology, whether it's improvements in battery technology, which will allow the grid to do even more kinds of stuff and bring renewables in. We don't know what's coming down the pike on the upside. And yes, we worry about the new things that will happen on the downside from the super empowered individuals who could do bad things. But, in a century, the basic question of what's going to power transportation is in play. We had an article in the spring by a serious that by 2030, probably half the vehicles in the U.S. fleet are going to be electric. That's an astonishing idea. And by the damn cars or more will be driving themselves. And that we don't even, this kind of stuff, the technological aspects of change and positive stuff is only going to accelerate. It's geometric, it's logarithmic, it's not arithmetic, and it's not just finding a new gas field. You talk about Central Asia. We used to talk about the Caspian Basin, right? That was a big thing 10 years ago. Screw the Caspian Basin. You can have a big field with a pot of oil under it. Now you can have technological development that'll get more out of the existing fields.
So it's fascinating to hear about a kind of self-perpetuating positive cycle. Nevertheless, when we think about the fact that these climate issues are not national, they're purely global. I mean, if the United States helps, that really is good. But absent the capacity of some kind of mutual understanding, which includes both Western countries, which are doing great things, and third world countries, which whatever good things they do are more than canceled out by the fact of their growth and thus their increasing use of carbon and so forth, of coal, raises a political question, which is there reason to feel confident that on climate, but I would say not even only on climate, on other kinds of global issues, nuclear non-proliferation, things like that there is anything like a will, this is something Obama has been trying very hard ever since he arrived in 2009 and had very little success on, that there is a will for the kind of collective action without which it's very hard to see your way to solving the problem. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, just in terms of climate, and, Phil was talking about, in terms of international development, and Obama has just recently said that all international development assistance will have a climate resiliency component, and that's part of, something that the United States government is doing. I think China, which is, the world's largest emitter of carbon emissions, it's facing a very hard reality in terms of that they cannot continue doing what they're doing. They have to change. They have to start moving away from coal, and they're doing that. They're doing that partially through natural gas. So I'm not really answering your question in terms of what is the likelihood of sort of global international cooperation
You're
around
saying it's
climate
necessary,
change.
but of course many necessary things don't happen.
Well, yeah, I do think it's necessary, and I think we do have to have we have to be doing more. But at the same time, I think the United States and is sort of moving forward. And as I pointed out earlier, emissions, have gone down and will continue to go down. I mean, in terms of the forecasts are that we will, go down another 5-6%, by 2020.
Okay.
Let me about the upsides of technological progress, because all the other methods have zero hope of success. You're never going to get international agreement. You're never going to get significant changes. You're never going to get painful cost adjustments. So I hope we don't have to go to geoengineering. I hope we can do changes in the technology of energy itself that will help deal with the problem. But if I'm wrong about the upsides of the technological progress, then we really are screwed.
Well, it's a matter of degree. You have to be really, really, really right, because obviously the problem is very urgent. So let me end by asking each of you to do this. So Gideon began by setting a tone, and I think the tone was, it's too easy to get mired in all the terrible stuff that's happening, and if you look on balance, you'll think, actually, trends are more positive than negative. So I'd like to ask each of you just to talk for a moment about the things in the world that you find encouraging and the things in the world discouraging or despairing, and if you'd like, your kind of intuitive sense about what the balance between the good stuff and the bad stuff is. So, Philip, I'm afraid I'm going to start with you because you're next to me.
Just to avoid your question for a second, in terms of international cooperation, Ebola is a central issue. It highlights the extent to which we have blocked that out as a problem affecting a few benighted African countries and nothing to do with us. But I think that there are loads of global health issues which will demand a much more sophisticated and international or global has just been weakened basically considerably in recent years. We've been happy to see the Gates Foundation and others taking over. I think a real problem. I think we need to build up cooperation. You mentioned human rights before. I didn't take up your opportunity. Obviously, I think that what I'd call the human rights revolution in terms of the empowerment of women, in terms of putting those issues on the international agenda big time, is extremely important and is going to play a big role in various societies coming to realize that the authoritarian regimes, and I would include the ISISes and others of the world, don't offer them what they increasingly are. We need, as a society, as a country, the United States and its allies, to be pushing much more strongly for the strengthening of the human rights regime.
Alexis?
Like Gideon, I am a sort of an optimist about the power of technology to transform our world. 10 years ago, you know, we were all using much more primitive forms of telephone communication. There were even social evolutionary biologists who theorized that maybe we would grow much longer thumbs evolutionarily to deal with our BlackBerries. I think very few of us currently use BlackBerries. We're living in the middle of a revolution right now, technology. And we don't know whether we're at the beginning of it or the middle of it or the end of it. But of 7 million people, of the estimated 7 million people who live in the world, the UNS...
Billion.
Billion people live in the world. And there are 6.8 billion cell phone subscriptions. This is from a UN technology agency. People who don't have running water or phones, people in refugee camps have cell phones. The UN has a group called UN Global Pulse, is able to kind of do early warning about famine and drought and crises, cell phone pattern behavior from the developing world. So fascinating, encouraging. I don't know where 10 years technologically. I don't know what we'll be using, but I do remain hopeful about that. The things that worry me are, like Philip, I am very concerned about public health issues. I think that the advances that we've made in some spheres in biomedical research have also had a kind of counter effect. Antibiotic resistance has created whole new bugs that have the power to infect and kill people. I'm very concerned about our commitment and the world's commitment to these public health issues.
I'm optimistic, as you can tell, about the power of technology in a whole variety of areas to make dramatic improvements in life in a lot of different ways. I'm pessimistic, worried about the stagnancy and sclerosis of our political institutions that seem to be unable to provide effective governance and effective policy approaches to a whole variety of things. We have a very sobering piece by Frank Fukuyama in the current issue from his new book that is all about the American political system, and I sort of stagnantly sliding in place in a mire while the world goes on. We're doing better than others, but that's not a very optimistic thing to be at the end of history and have your institutions. And I have to say, if I'm wrong, I worry that I may be wrong about the climate stuff. In other words, if I look down the road and I think what are the things that are really big game changers in a negative way, the way other people used to worry a little more about nuclear weapons. I never worried that much about nuclear proliferation, frankly. But I worry that I may be wrong and overly complacent about climate because since I don't think we're going to do anything on the international institutional front, if the gloom and doomsayers are correct, then we really are going to be in big trouble.
Open keynote and to his subsequent comments, and I kept thinking to myself, I thought I was an optimist. I think I am an optimist, actually. Maybe not quite to the degree Ian is, but at the moment I'm spending my time building up a small organization that's focused on the criminal justice system. And even in that dysfunctional excuse for a justice system, I can see causes for optimism. Other things, it's one of the very few places in our political life where there is actually some overlap between right and left about the need to reform mass incarceration. So that's a good thing. You know, I put some hope in technology, not quite as much as Ian does. I put considerable hope in generational change. I think the millennials have interest and attitude, whether they become active, whether they sort of attach their idealism to causes and go out and fight for them is yet to be seen, but that makes me optimistic. The two things that worry me, I guess, are criminal justice aside, the polarization of our politics, and not just in the United States, but globally, and complacency.
I'd like to end on a positive note, so I'll start with the things that worry me, and I'll finish with the things that I'm hopeful about. Yeah, I mean, climate is definitely something I'm very concerned about. I mean, I think that, you know, the climate is changing. I think there are many in the world, including right here, where we're not doing enough to create the resiliencies that we need. I'm very frightened by the dysfunction in government. I read Ms. Gideon was pointing out in terms of the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs and the dysfunction and the decay, and that frightens me, that, you know, young people are just going to become so disenfranchised and so disconnected from government that they're not going to want to participate. And that, I think, is very troubling. Education, I think we need to do a lot more to make sure that we have quality education, not just here in the United States, but around the world, making sure that girls are represented in the classroom and creating much greater access, also on the human rights front. And in terms of what gives me tremendous hope, I teach, and I spend a lot of time with young people who really care about the world and making a difference. It's, you know, every day that I walk into the classroom, I read the paper and I'm feeling rather, you know, the gloom and doom sort of comes over me, and then I walk into the classroom and, you know, I hear the ideas, I hear the, you know, the possibilities, the different ways of seeing the world, maybe in ways that I don't see, and that gives me tremendous hope. I have two young boys, and I have to. We're going to do more and rise to, you know, the challenges that the world requires. So I do remain hopeful in the fact that, you know, we have a younger generation that cares about making a difference.
Well, thank you. That was a tremendous display of, I think, judgment and erudition on an incredibly wide array of subjects. That was just really great. So, for a brief round of applause. So what we're going to do now is there will be persons with handheld microphones walking around, and so if you do want to ask a question, please beckon to them, and when you stand up, tell us who you are, and then say something that ends with a question mark. I don't think so. Here, take mine. I'll live without it.
You know, this is years of technology. I have yet to be at any kind of a meeting where there isn't an audio-visual breakdown.
But in 10 years, it'll be very different. I'm Robert Petersak. I am pleased to be on the advisory board of the CGA, and would like to congratulate and Vera on the wonderful anniversary that they are celebrating here today. But I noticed that in this very informative and very intellectual discussion of the challenges of the next 10 years, that there has been only passing reference to an 800-pound gorilla I have particular fondness for, and that is China. In your view, because you don't see China as a major challenge, or just that the challenges that China presents in military, political, economic, and other spheres pale compared to the others?
I should say it's because I forgot to ask it. That's the only reason why. but please somebody respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think the rise of China is one of the extraordinary stories of our era. It's been a massive good. Hundreds of millions of people have come out of absolute poverty and risen into the middle class. The level of development, human development that has occurred is wonderful, objectively. As cosmopolitans, we should all like that. It's on track to continue. The political system has opened up a little bit. Because I believe in modernization theory, don't worry about the very long-term future, because I think that over time, their development will either lead to social and political change that will mollify the system, moderate the system a little bit, or that if it doesn't, the progress will stop. Advanced industrial society in the modern era from a top-down command approach and have a success. So this is the practical policy challenge is a sort of generational, long, careful dealing with an adolescent that avoids open conflict and nudges things. They become a more responsible adult, as Bob Zoellick said, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And so it's a practical challenge, but I don't think of it as a disaster, inevitable war, and it's something people in security are aware of. And
Anybody else want to respond to that, or should we move on to the next question?
Bill Kulik. I want to say that I think it was quite striking that it took an hour and 42 minutes before the subject of climate change came up. And I think that reflects a very worrisome sense of priority. Because I think, frankly, that everything else that has been discussed here will become irrelevant if the current trends continue and the global climate surpasses the 350 parts per million that have been defined as the sort of the limit of human civilization. And I'd just like to ask the whole panel to prognosticate what will look like 10 years from now if the temperature has increased another degree and millions of people are climate refugees, that the oceans are rising, et cetera. You know all of the consequences. I'd like to have some of you just prognosticate on how that will affect the international order.
Or maybe you could prognosticate on whether you feel that the trajectory is of growth of emissions is going to start curving downwards in a meaningful way.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of looking at 10 years, I think if you are a small Pacific island state, I think there are some very sort of serious concerns in terms of with rising sea level, and I don't think that the system is at all prepared for it. I mean, when you look at international law around refugees, climate refugees have not yet been dealt with, and I think that that's something that we need to confront. So, I think there are different parts of the world that will, for example, in the next 10 years could be severely impacted. I mean, the Arctic is, it's in terms of climate change, it's twice as quickly as the rest of the world. So as a region, it's definitely something of concern in terms of the impact it's having on terms of rising sea level.
I'm a little less sanguine than you are about that. I don't think it's just the kind of drama that's going to transpire in the Pacific Islands or even just in the Arctic. I think we're already seeing consequences. Phil has been dying for us to bring Australia into the conversation. I think Australia just had a historic heat wave, high temperature year. And I hope technology will get us out of this, and I share Gideon's suspicion that there's not going to be some global movement where we all join arms and solve the problem multilaterally. But I don't think that's what I meant by complacency. I don't think that's a reason for us not to take a leadership position on this issue. I think it's the most important issue facing us.
If I can, that the I don't share Gideon's optimism. I'm a bit sure I can edit Foreign Affairs and be constantly dealing with all the world's crises and remain as extraordinarily optimistic as he seems to be. But I do think that's misplaced in relation to climate change. I think that it sure ain't the Pacific Islands that we need to worry about. Many of them are going to disappear. It's all of the climate regions. If you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report, the impact is going to be absolutely dramatic. And linked to that, another issue that hasn't come up, and I feel a bit ashamed, of course, is the continuation of extreme poverty in the world. The fact that there continue to be 1 million people, by the World Bank's conservative estimates, and 2 billion by most experts' estimates, people who live in extreme poverty, whose position is not being touched at all by much of the progress that we are talking about. Indeed, the inequality persists in those areas as well, and their boat lifted, and we're doing nothing about it. The reason I mention it here is that even the World Bank and others emphasize when it comes to climate change that the greatest impact is going to be on those 1 billion or 2 billion. We can get our way out of it technologically. They won't be able to. We need a fundamental change of attitude. And a country like Australia is a classic. Australia is now sort of officially a climate change denier. They have repealed carbon legislation, they are churning out the coal, and they are pretending that this is not an issue. That's not sustainable.
I published The Pessimist too, I just don't agree with him. On the climate change, I actually agree with Phil on this, which is that I think it's going to have a differential effect, and that rather than not affecting anybody or affecting everybody terribly, I think that you'll see a lot of adaptation in areas that are rich enough or dynamic enough or successful enough or creative enough to deal with it, and a lot of areas that are going to be struck very badly. And as usual, this change is going to screw the world's poor and disenfranchised and weak more than the rich who will find ways of dealing with it. With regard to the Arctic, it's actually a fascinating question because you're not just seeing the Arctic's effect on the oceans. The Arctic itself is going to be this incredible new region of the world that open not just for business but for exploration and for trade. It's going to be the next 50 years. You're going to see places like Reykjavik and Anchorage being the Singapore's and Taiwan's and Hong Kong's of the next half century in a very interesting way.
And they'll be able to grow cotton there, which is all right. We need a microphone. Then go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Professor Haslund, when talking about what could be done to help the developing countries, he mentioned taxation. I was wondering whether that's one important issue for, maybe countries that are at mid-level income, yes, but I'm thinking, why don't we talk about some old ideas that didn't work? One is, and we've talked a lot about technology. What about transfer of technology, which is an idea that came up in the 70s, but not much has been done. WIPO has, all kind of schemes and so on, but it has not worked. And in the context of climate change, actually, that's something that could be used to help developing countries. And second old idea that could be used is the idea of changing the international regime for foreign direct investment. And we're seeing issues with Argentina now. I think that's one area where we could have rules that are more favorable to developing countries and that promote their development. And third old idea that's not been really pursued is, in general, changing the rules of international trade, more conducive to development. WTO has been working on this, but nothing came out of it. So I'd like to have your views on how those old ideas could be pushed now and give more results.
Anybody want to address those multi-pronged questions?
No.
Go ahead.
I mean, what you're describing, of course, is the 1970s the new international economic order, which has pretty much disappeared from the agenda. But I think we have to look at it through new eyes. I mean, transfer of technology in those days was seen as, what are we doing in a formal sense to make technologies available to developing country governments? But as probably Alexis said, I think when I go to the Central African Republic, which is an incredibly poor country, there are cell phones everywhere. The streets are lined with these little boxes, which are stalls selling SIM cards and so on. So I think we are transferring technology pretty dramatically. I think there are other examples that are much more worrying. Sorry to come back to Ebola again, I'm not obsessed, but the fact that we did nothing to try to develop a vaccine when it was only Africans who were dying, but now that there's a risk that we might also be affected, we're suddenly pulling all the stops out. That's the sort of thing that could have been done much earlier. In terms of tax regimes, I think, or in terms of regimes for dealing with debtor states, and you give the example of Argentina, I think we do have to do something, and there are lots of proposals out there for ways in which countries might actually be able to go into some sort of bankruptcy regime rather than face the black or white picture that has emerged from the US District Court on that case.
And I also think just generally the promotion of education beyond very rudimentary levels, and was talking about the education of women, and that is a great boost economically in the long run for society. It was something that Hillary Clinton had at the forefront of her agenda as Secretary of State, but I think equally it applies to young men as well. And I think that's the biggest guarantor for the future prosperity of any society.
I think that actually for something like FDI, that these days there's so much capital looking for a home and looking for a return on investment that developing countries, frankly, can do more to attract it themselves through appropriate reforms than they need help in getting from outside. I mean, if you take a look at countries like, let's say, Mexico under Peña Nieto or the Philippines under Noynoy, I mean, these are places that are going to get surges of external capital because they are taking steps that will actually make economic development something that the government is trying to support and enable, and they will find willing and outside partners for that. And countries that persist in policies that don't seem optimized for that are going to find themselves needing more handouts. And I think that one of the great stories of the decade recently, and hopefully will continue the next decade as well, is the rise of development and marketization of things like in countries such as Africa, which are coming into the world economy as not just dependent clients or not just targets of aid or not just objects, but subjects of good old-fashioned capitalist development at early stages that will hopefully, ultimately, with help, with more investment, with a much longer time frame, with institutional reform and change, allow them to follow the kinds that many nations in Asia and Latin and elsewhere have followed to become key players in the world economy in a productive and mutually beneficial way. I think the African Trade Summit over the summer, the U.S. Leaders Summit, was a real step forward, both an acknowledgement of what's happened and a real step forward for the future.
Can I get my microphone back? Maybe I'll say something. Who's... You have any questions?
Yep. Yep.
We have the mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just speak loud.
You shouldn't have given me back that microphone.
Albert Golston, there's been a rise, of course, of the mega corporations that have, most of them have actually more, revenue than the country's GDPs. And they have more and more influence over government decisions. So in 10 years, how do we know that policies are more governmental or
Who'd like to take that on? Corporations, good or bad? Mega corporations, good or bad?
I think one of the keys here is transparency. It goes, I don't want to change the conversation, it goes back though to mentioned WikiLeaks and Snowden and so on. There are two very separate aspects of that whole saga. One is the process, which is the degree of secrecy on the part of the government, the degree to which we were not informed of the policies that were being pursued very vigorously. And the second issue is the separate one of privacy implications. But I think it's the same with corporations, that the big challenge now is to get a greater degree of transparency. And again, that's what the OECD is currently working on, trying to get country-by-country declarations of the financial interests of each country. So in other words, where is Apple? You know, Apple, the famous Irish corporation, because that's where so much of its money is put through. We don't get any detailed accounting from them. Therefore, we can't regulate them. Therefore, we don't know what their deeper impact on policies is. I don't think one needs to be counter or anti-corporations, but I do think there needs to be a regime which suddenly makes it more feasible for government, policymakers, and the public to start calling them to account based on information about their activity, not have at present.
I think we have time for one more question. So please tell us who you are and make it a really good one. We can't hear you, wait, sir. Yeah.
Quick, your mic.
Yep. Wait, give the gentleman the microphone, please. There, yes, that's good. Now we hear you.
The point that I want to bring up is the cyber warfare that's going on. They feel that the last attack against the biggest bank in the United States, Chase, came from Russia. And if that's true, then we're in for a different kind of a war, because you can decimate a country overnight, because it affects all the people that had that bank, used the bank as an outlet, and the same thing with any one of the other people that have been attacked. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the fact that Russia was behind the Chase bank is a very serious situation. They don't know.
Sir, what is, I just have to, we're getting short of time. What's the question you wanted to ask?
How would we go about handling this particular situation, which is a warfare that's already started?
Okay, thank you. Anyone would like to speak to that? What to do about cyber warfare?
I think that's a question for an optimist.
Alexis?
Yeah. I am, look, all the agencies of law enforcement are being brought to bear on this question, and obviously the New York Times story said that the president's first question, or his repeated questions have been, you know, is this just a regular old hacking, or is it Putin? And there are obviously networks of cyber hackers in the former Soviet Union, and whether they are also at the direction of political forces, you know, you can just imagine. But I think that certainly, you know, the FBI and other intelligence organizations are going to be looking into this very, very harshly. I mean, this was, I think, as we were saying before this panel, you know, maybe just a warning shot, since none of the information was actually used or corrupted, as in previous hacking episodes where people's accounts were compromised. So, warning shot it may be a kind of a warning for warfare, as you say.
You know, I started out by saying that I would consider this the era of globalization. And, you know, globalization is all about increasing flows of information, of goods, of services, of people, of all sorts of things, ideas. And the challenge in that era, right, the great overarching that it's applicable in many different issue areas, right, is how to encourage and enable the healthy, positive flows and how to police and constrict and protect yourself from the harmful negative flows and the dangers that come from being exposed and open. We find that, you want to encourage people to go everywhere, but you want to stop the terrorists from coming in. You want to have the containers bringing nice goods to you, but you don't want the bomb to come in as well. You want to have all the upsides of information technology and the cloud and everything else and being linked to the entire world at the drop of a hat, but you also want to protect yourself from the criminals, from the invaders of your privacy and security and so forth. There's no easy answer. This is an ongoing challenge in both areas, and I would say the cyber issue is a real one. And it's the downside of some of the upsides. The only way to stop it entirely is to go off the grid, which we don't want to do because we couldn't cut ourselves off. And that's emblematic of the challenge of the era, which is balancing the upsides and downsides of all these flows. We're in a state of flow, and how do we keep the bad guys and bad things out and enable the good things and the good guys to link us together? That's the challenge.
So let me just end by saying I think that what you've all heard tonight is an intriguing degree of variation in the sense of how one should look at this next decade in terms of the balance between hopefulness and what there's worth being hopeful about, and pessimism and what there's worth being pessimistic about. So that means each one of you can make an existential choice as you go home, whether you should feel better or worse than you did when you got here. So thank you all very much for your excellent questions, and thank you for coming out tonight.
Good ending.